Judge insults Jasmine Crockett in court. Minutes later, she flips the entire courtroom and gets him arrested. The courtroom door creaked open with an eerie slowness, every eye turning in perfect, predatory synchronization. Jasmine Crockett stepped in, alone, steady, and unapologetically defiant. Yet the weight of the room hit her like a wall of ice. There was no welcome, no professional courtesy, not even a nod. Only silence and eyes. Dozens of them. Cold, dismissive, judgmental. As if she didn't belong. As if she were an intruder in a sacred space reserved for the powerful and corrupt. Her tailored suit, crisp case files, and quiet resolve could not shield her from the unspoken accusation lingering in the air. "You don't belong here." The room didn't need to say it aloud. Its silence screamed it. But Jasmine kept walking. At the center of it all sat Judge Howard Gates, his presence as imposing as it was venomous. A man both feared and revered, known for wielding his gavel like a blade. Quick, brutal, and merciless. He didn't rise. He didn't even acknowledge Jasmine's presence until she reached the prosecutor's table. Then slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowed with the gleam of condescension. The corners of his mouth twitched, not in welcome, but in disdain. He spoke without ceremony, his voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "I hope you're not here to perform, Ms. Crockett," he said, each word dipped in contempt. "We have no time for cheap political theater." His tone was not just dismissive, it was an insult, a deliberate public branding meant to humiliate her before she had said a single word. And it worked, at least for a moment. The courtroom remained dead silent, but not for long. From the defense table came a low, stifled chuckle, then another, quiet snickers like snakes hissing in the shadows. Jasmine heard them clearly, every smirk behind her back echoing louder than a gunshot. She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. But inside, a familiar ache returned, one she'd known too many times. The ache of walking into rooms where justice was a costume and prejudice was policy. She had come prepared with evidence, facts, and law. But in that moment, it was clear. This courtroom wasn't a battlefield. It was a rigged arena, and she was meant to be the entertainment before the slaughter. Still, she stood tall, refusing to give the wolves the satisfaction of seeing her bleed. Judge Gates watched her closely, as if measuring how long it would take to break her spirit. His fingers tapped the edge of the bench, a rhythmic taunt that filled the silence with foreboding. Jasmine placed her file gently on the table, but the sound it made when it landed was deafening in the quiet room. Every move she made, every breath she took, was scrutinized, dissected, mocked. "Let's be clear," Gates continued, voice rising just enough to command the room without shouting. "If you're here to parade around with your progressive talking points, this court has little patience. We deal in reality, not rhetoric." His words weren't just cruel. They were loaded, crafted to undermine her credibility, her experience, even her intelligence. Not a judge dispensing justice, but a man guarding his domain with venom and ego. Jasmine's jaw tightened. She didn't respond immediately. She knew better than to play into his game. The weight of history pressed on her chest. Years of watching women like her be silenced, dismissed, erased. But this time was different. This time, she had walked straight into the lion's den, not as prey, but as a spark they hoped to snuff out before it turned to fire. Around her, the gallery remained still, except for those subtle shifts, those whispered murmurs that always follow public humiliation. But Jasmine didn't blink. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, steady, and sharp as glass. "Your Honor, I'm here to present facts. Nothing more, nothing less." It wasn't defiance, it was clarity, the kind that cut deeper than shouting ever could. But Gates was unmoved. "Facts?" he sneered, leaning back with a theatrical roll of his eyes. "I've seen more compelling arguments from first-year interns." Again, the defense table chuckled. Again, the room dipped into a silence soaked with tension. Jasmine knew what this was. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a performance, a calculated attempt to discredit her in the eyes of the court, the jury, the press. She looked around, at the cameras, the notepads, the faces half hidden behind screens. She could feel the narrative being written without her. Young black attorney tries to take on the system, fails spectacularly. That was the story they wanted. That was the ending they had already prepared. But Jasmine had walked into this room knowing it wouldn't be fair. She hadn't expected applause or courtesy. She had expected fire. And fire she could handle. She let the insults land, let the laughter swell, let the judge gloat, because behind her silence was a storm waiting to rise. Jasmine Crockett stood with quiet defiance, a single folder gripped tightly in her hand. Exhibit A, her first strike in a case built on weeks of sleepless nights and painstaking investigation. The pages within detailed a complex web of financial deceit, inflated project budgets, falsified invoices, and reallocated state funds that vanished into the pockets of the rich and powerful. She stepped forward and placed the file on the evidence table, her voice steady as she spoke. Your Honor, this document outlines unauthorized financial transfers tied directly to the Lawson development contracts. These discrepancies are not clerical errors. They are deliberate theft of taxpayer money. She turned slightly to face the courtroom, projecting both confidence and clarity. But before the evidence could even be reviewed, before a single line was considered, Judge Howard Gates leaned back in his chair and let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. Ms. Crockett, he sneered, are you planning to bury this courtroom in garbage? Because that's what this looks like, rubbish. Pages and pages of noise, and not a single fact worth our time. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, as if the oxygen had been ripped from the room. She opened her mouth to respond, but Gates was already talking over her. His voice rose not with passion, but with precision, slicing through her argument before it even began. We don't have time to indulge in fantasy spreadsheets and desperate conjecture, he declared, waving his hand dismissively over the folder as if it were filth. You bring in stacks of paperwork as if volume equals credibility, but this court deals in substance, not theatrics. Jasmine tried again, her voice firmer now. These aren't conjectures, Your Honor. They are verified transactions, cross-referenced with city planning budgets and state audit logs. She flipped open the first page, her hands steady, but Gates didn't look. Objection sustained, he barked, though no objection had been made. This entire line of evidence is inadmissible on the grounds of irrelevance. The defense attorney smirked from his seat. The court reporter blinked rapidly, unsure whether to type or wait for order. Around them, the gallery remained silent, but not because they didn't care. They were watching a demolition in real time. Jasmine felt the heat rise behind her eyes, but she refused to let it show. She had faced worse, been underestimated, overruled, and overlooked, but never like this. This wasn't a challenge of law. This was an execution of her voice. With respect, Your Honor, she said, forcing each word through clenched teeth. I haven't been allowed to present a single sentence from the document. Gates smiled, a thin, cruel thing. And yet, I've already heard enough, he said flatly. I don't need to waste this court's time with the fantasies of a lawyer who clearly thinks courtroom drama is the same thing as legal merit. The words stung not because they were true, but because they were so clearly crafted to humiliate. Jasmine wasn't being critiqued. She was being crushed. Not because her evidence lacked strength, but because her presence challenged the unspoken order of power that ruled that room. Around her, everything felt calculated. The snide looks from the defense team, the performative exhaustion on the judge's face. Even the silence from the gallery reeked of quiet approval. It was as if the entire room had rehearsed this moment, one where the outsider, the idealist, the woman who dared to believe in justice, would be publicly shamed for her audacity. Jasmine stood her ground, her breathing slow and measured, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her waver. This isn't about theatrics, she said, louder now, pushing her voice through the fog of contempt. This is about financial misconduct of the highest order. Money meant for schools, hospitals, and roads, stolen and laundered through shell contracts. I have proof. She held up the next page, one containing the payment ledger signed by both Lawson and a city treasurer. But again, Gates struck down with his gavel, louder this time, drowning her out. This isn't a conspiracy theory conference, Ms. Crockett, he snapped. You're not going to stand in my courtroom and turn it into a stage for your personal crusade? The words hit like bullets, each one designed to belittle, discredit, and destroy. Jasmine's heart pounded, not from fear, but from fury. She had come prepared to argue law, but now she was fighting for the right to be heard. She looked around the room and realized she wasn't just against one man. She was against a machine that didn't fear facts but feared exposure. She gathered her papers slowly, methodically, refusing to back away like a defeated fighter. If seeking truth is a crusade, then yes, I will carry that banner, she said under her breath, eyes locked on the judge. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just hostile, it was her battlefield, and she wasn't retreating. The tension in the courtroom had already reached a boiling point, but Judge Gates wasn't finished. He leaned forward on the bench, his fingers steepled, voice lowered just enough to make the venom feel more personal. You know, Ms. Crockett, he began, the words oozing with performative civility. People like you often walk into these halls with a chip on your shoulder, hoping to rewrite history with idealism and half-baked legal theories. The room went still, not out of shock, but out of anticipation. They'd seen this before. This wasn't a critique of her case anymore. It was a character assassination. You come here waving around documents and pretending you're a savior, but you forget where you come from. Don't let your background mislead you into thinking that passion substitutes for professionalism. His eyes narrowed, cold and exacting. Frankly, I'm tired of courtroom crusaders who think their skin color entitles them to moral authority. The words hung in the air like poison. Jasmine didn't move. She couldn't. Her body had stiffened, locked between fury and restraint. Her right hand gripped the edge of the prosecution table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Beneath the surface, her blood boiled, her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Yet her face remained unreadable, jaw clenched, lips sealed, eyes forward. But inside it was chaos. A hurricane of humiliation, rage, and disbelief churned just beneath the surface. She could feel the stares pressing in, like invisible hands judging her reaction more than the words spoken. She blinked once, slowly, and in that moment her eyes shimmered, not from defeat but from restraint, because crying here would be surrender, and she had come too far, survived too much to give them that victory. She opened her mouth, prepared to speak, to reclaim her space, her dignity, but Gates cut her off again, this time louder, sharper, and laced with open mockery. Where did you even study law, Ms. Crockett? He sneered. YouTube University? Or was it some activist boot camp that hands out law degrees with protest signs? A ripple of laughter came from the defense table, a cruel confirmation that the humiliation was working. Jasmine stood frozen, absorbing the blows in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood the trap. Every insult was bait. Every interruption was designed to provoke. He wasn't just trying to dismiss her. He was trying to break her, publicly, piece by piece. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of justice. It felt like a stage for abuse. Every word from the bench dripped with arrogance, with the weight of unchecked power. Gates was no longer pretending to be impartial. He had made it personal. You know what I think? He continued, voice rising in false exasperation. I think you're here because someone thought putting a loud voice in a courtroom would make headlines. Not because you have a real case, not because you understand the law, but because you're useful for optics. Jasmine's spine straightened as the words cut deeper than any legal argument ever could. He wasn't just attacking her professionalism, he was attacking her existence, her identity, her right to even stand in that courtroom. She fought to steady her breathing, anchoring herself in the rhythm of it. Inhale, hold, exhale. Her fingers trembled slightly, betraying the calm on her face. Still, she refused to blink, refused to look down. Her gaze met his, direct, unwavering, defiant. Let him see that she wasn't afraid. Let him see that every time he tried to drag her down, he was only sharpening the steel inside her. She finally managed to speak, though her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I am here because the law demands accountability, not comfort. But Gates cut her off mid-sentence. slamming his gavel with theatrical force. "Don't lecture me," he snapped. "This is not your soapbox, and you are not some legal messiah." The words echoed off the wooden walls, sharp and brutal. Courtroom sat in stunned silence, not out of sympathy, but because they sensed they were witnessing a public execution disguised as a legal proceeding. Jasmine stood there, isolated and exposed, a single woman holding her ground while the weight of institutional bias pressed down on her from every direction. The injustice wasn't subtle, it was deliberate, calculated, and absolute. Still, she did not flinch. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett became more than a lawyer. She became a symbol of every person who had ever been silenced, belittled, or erased in rooms like this. Her silence was not weakness, it was power restrained. Her stillness was not defeat. It was the calm before the eruption. And while the court might have laughed with Gates today, she knew something they didn't. The truth was on her side. And when it finally broke through the cracks of this corrupted room, it would burn everything that tried to bury it. Jasmine stood motionless for a beat, the chaos in her chest eclipsed only by the chilling precision of what she was about to do. With a quiet exhale, she reached into her case and pulled out a single document. No fanfare, no preamble. The room was still reeling from Judge Gates' relentless attacks, but the tide was about to shift. She walked slowly toward the projector, her heels clicking like a countdown, and placed the paper under the lens. The screen behind her flickered to life, and with it, the air changed. There it was, a city planning contract, grossly inflated, signed and authorized not only by the lead developer, but also by Judge Howard Gates himself. A gasp cut through the courtroom like a blade. Time seemed to pause as eyes darted between the document and the man on the bench. For a single heartbeat, Gates was frozen, and his face, usually unreadable, flashed pale with recognition. The silence was no longer neutral, it had turned on him. But the moment didn't last. Like a cornered animal, Gates struck back with practiced venom. "That document is inadmissible," he spat, his voice louder than necessary, trembling at the edges. "It was obtained improperly, irrelevant, invalid, and unconstitutional." His words poured out in a flurry, designed not to argue but to erase. He didn't even bother examining the evidence. He didn't ask its source, its chain of custody, or its connection to the case. He simply condemned it, on sight, on instinct, because he knew what it was. It wasn't just paper, it was a mirror. One that showed his reflection with all the corruption and filth he had spent decades hiding behind a robe. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood tall, letting the silence linger, letting the weight of the revelation hang like storm clouds over the courtroom. She turned toward the bench, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "Your Honor," she said, the irony of the title thick in the air. "The contract was acquired legally through subpoena, verified by 2 independent agencies. The signature matches your own on record." Another ripple moved through the gallery, tension crackling like static electricity. Gates slammed his gavel, desperate to reclaim control. "I said it's inadmissible," he barked. "This ends now." But the command fell flat. The jury had seen it. The reporters had seen it. The bailiff had seen it. No matter how loudly he yelled, no matter how furiously he gestured, he could not unsee what had just been made visible. And more importantly, he could not make them forget it. Jasmine's eyes were locked on him, unwavering. "If the court is allowed to discard evidence without due review," she said, "then we're not conducting a trial. We're running a charade." Her words didn't rise in volume, but they carried weight, heavy and damning. Gates glared back at her, but his bluster was cracked now, the armor of arrogance showing fractures. He shuffled the papers on his desk, looking for an exit, for a legal technicality, for anything that could restore the illusion of control. But the courtroom was no longer his, not entirely. Whispers broke out among the jurors. Pens scratched frantically as journalists scribbled every word. The balance had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Still, Jasmine knew this wasn't victory. Not yet. She had seen power squirm before. It doesn't fall quietly. It claws, it bites, it drags everything down with it. "The public deserves transparency," she continued. walking back to the table with calm precision. And this courtroom, above all, deserves truth. Gates opened his mouth to respond but found no words that could mask his panic. His robe felt heavier now, the bench higher, colder, more isolated. He tried to sneer, but the mask of superiority no longer fit. For once, he was the one on trial, and Jasmine had made sure there was no place left to hide. Around them, the courtroom was no longer an audience. It was a jury. Every glance, every breath, every heartbeat aligned against the man who had ruled with impunity for too long. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, not broken, not silenced, but rising. She hadn't just presented a document. She had shattered a wall, one forged from fear, power, and unspoken rules. Now, with just a single piece of truth, the foundation was cracking, and the collapse was only beginning. And Jasmine wasn't finished, because what she revealed next would silence the entire courtroom and turn fear into fury. Jasmine Crockett didn't tremble. She didn't stall. While the courtroom buzzed with tension thick enough to drown in, she moved with the steadiness of a surgeon preparing for a final incision. Her hand reached into the briefcase with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing the truth is about to do what no argument, no plea, and no protocol ever could. Cut through corruption like fire through paper. Without a word, she placed a compact audio recorder on the evidence table, clicked the volume up, and pressed play. What followed wasn't static or courtroom chatter. It was a voice, low and familiar, stained with contempt and authority. Make sure that girl doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. Clean everything up. The words crawled through the speakers and exploded in the courtroom like a grenade. Gasps erupted. Pens fell from reporters' hands. Several jurors froze mid-blink, their faces draining of color. The gallery murmured with disbelief, the sound like the first gust of a coming storm. Judge Howard Gates didn't speak, not immediately. His mouth opened slightly, his jaw locking as though the words had knocked the breath from him. For a split second, just long enough for Jasmine to see it, he wasn't the untouchable figure robed in black. He was just a man, cornered, exposed, and terrified. But like a seasoned predator, Gates recovered quickly, or at least tried to. He straightened, forced a sneer, and barked, "This is a violation of privacy. That recording is inadmissible and illegally obtained." His voice boomed, but the echo that once commanded fear now rang hollow. There was no strength behind it, no shield left to hide behind. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She reached for another folder, this one marked with a red tab, and opened it with the same precision she used to dismantle lies. Inside was a printed transcript, line for line, word for word, matching the audio that had just sliced through the courtroom like a scalpel. She held it up high for the gallery to see and laid it on the projector. The text illuminated on the screen behind her, each damning sentence displayed like a scar carved into the very walls of the courthouse. This transcript, Jasmine said, her voice ringing clear, was authenticated by 2 independent forensic audio labs. It matches the wiretap approved by the State Ethics Bureau during their internal corruption probe. Her eyes locked onto Gates. "And your voice, Judge Gates, is unmistakable." A wave of murmurs swept through the room, stronger this time, no longer whispers but the sound of truth awakening. Gates leaned forward, his knuckles white against the wood of his bench. "This is outrageous. You've overstepped every boundary of this court," he thundered. But it was the rage of a man watching his empire crumble, not the certainty of a judge dispensing order. Jasmine didn't answer his outburst. She didn't have to. The evidence had spoken louder than anything she could say. Around her, the faces of the jury were no longer blank slates. They were filled with disbelief, with anger, with realization. They had watched her be disrespected, silenced, diminished. Now they were watching the veil drop, revealing the rot that had been hidden behind the robe. And in the eyes of the press, pens scribbled with renewed fury, every headline already writing itself in their minds. Still calm, Jasmine placed the next document on the table, a call log cross-referenced with the judge's private line, time-stamped and synced to the exact minute of the recording. As this call occurred during the period in which key financial records went missing From the Planning Commission's database, she continued, the connection is not just clear, it's irrefutable. Another burst of sound filled the courtroom. Journalists whispering, the audience shifting in their seats, defense attorneys exchanging panicked glances. The temperature in the room had changed. Jasmine was no longer the one under scrutiny. Howard Gates was no longer the judge. He was the defendant, the predator cornered. He tried again to regain footing, slamming his gavel so hard the sound cracked like a gunshot. This hearing is over, he shouted. You are out of line, Miss Crockett. But the words had lost their power. They floated, empty, over a courtroom no longer willing to believe him. Jasmine stepped forward, slow and deliberate, the weight of justice behind every movement. You declared my evidence irrelevant. You mocked my credentials. You silenced my arguments, she said, her voice like iron wrapped in velvet. But you can't silence this. She pointed to the transcript. You can't unsay what everyone in this room just heard, and you can't outrun the truth that now has your name etched into it. The judge's hands trembled now, subtly, but Jasmine saw it. Everyone did. It wasn't just the end of a performance, it was the collapse of a regime. A courtroom that had once served as Gates's fortress was now his prison. The room felt different. It pulsed with a new energy, not just righteous anger, but the fragile rising breath of hope. The kind of hope that only comes when someone finally dares to shatter the silence. Jasmine turned back to the gallery, to the jury, to the court reporter whose fingers now flew across the keys with a purpose renewed. The law is not meant to protect the powerful, she said, her voice steady, rising. It is meant to expose the truth, no matter who it threatens. No one spoke. No one needed to. The evidence was undeniable. The mask had been ripped off. Judge Howard Gates had written his own verdict, and Jasmine had simply pressed play. The courtroom stood on the edge of silence, teetering between disbelief and reckoning. The transcript still glowed on the screen behind Jasmine, its damning words echoing like a drumbeat through every mind in the room. The audio recording had finished playing, but its impact hadn't faded. It hung heavy, suffocating. Jasmine turned slowly, deliberately, her gaze locking on the uniformed officer stationed near the rear of the chamber. The room held its breath as she raised her voice. Not loud, but sharp, clear and resonant like a bell-breaking morning silence. Officer Reynolds, she said, not looking away, Timphon Howard Gates is hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice and judicial misconduct. The statement hit like a hammer. The air seemed to shift, as if gravity itself had changed. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes snapped to Gates. For a second, the great judge, the untouchable, the unshakable, sat frozen. His lips parted, but no sound came. His fingers curled tightly around the edges of his bench, turning white with pressure. Then the rage exploded from within him like a dam breaking. "You can't do this!" he roared, standing so quickly that his chair scraped backward with a screech. "No one is allowed to do this to me?" The volume of his voice boomed through the room, but there was no command left in it. It was desperation, wild, unfiltered panic from a man watching his empire collapse around him. "I am this court," he bellowed, as if yelling it would make it true. But the badge of power he'd once wielded now looked brittle, laughable, like a mask crumbling under floodlight. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't step back. Her posture never shifted. She had been belittled, dismissed, torn apart piece by piece in this very room, and now she stood unmoved, while the man who tried to erase her came apart at the seams. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm as ice. "You are not this court. You corrupted it, and today it ends." At her signal, Officer Reynolds stepped forward, boots heavy against the polished floor, each step echoing louder than the last. The sound was not fast, it was deliberate, like a funeral drum announcing the death of unchecked power. Gates flinched as the officer reached the bench, eyes darting, searching the room for someone, anyone who might save him. But there were no allies left. The defense team had gone quiet, their eyes cast downward. The gallery sat frozen, stunned into silence. Even the court reporter, who had typed through every insult and ruling, now paused her keys midair. The judge backed away from the edge of the bench, shaking his head in disbelief, still muttering, "This isn't happening. This isn't how this ends." But the cold steel of the handcuffs gleamed beneath the courtroom lights, undeniable and absolute. Officer Reynolds moved behind him and began reciting the Miranda rights. Gates tried to shake him off, shouting, "This is illegal. This is madness." But his voice had no weight now. His authority was gone. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound cut through the courtroom like thunder, sharp, final, unforgiving. The very same man who had silenced truth with a gavel now stood speechless, shackled by it. Jasmine watched, not with triumph, but with quiet resolve. This wasn't victory. It was justice long delayed, finally crawling out from beneath the rubble of abuse. Gates's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no condescension, only fear. And in her eyes, there was no vengeance, just truth, just consequence. He struggled one last time, yelling, "You'll regret this. I'll bury you." But no one listened. No one cared. His voice faded into nothing, swallowed by the very walls he once controlled. Officer Reynolds led him down the steps from the bench. Each one he descended felt like a lifetime, a fall from the pedestal he'd built on lies and intimidation. The courtroom doors swung open, and the hallway beyond was flooded with flashing lights and waiting reporters. The image would be broadcast across the country before the hour ended. A disgraced judge, once considered untouchable, being led out in cuffs by a woman he had tried to humiliate and destroy. Jasmine remained still, every muscle in her body wound tight, not because she feared backlash, but because she understood the weight of what had just happened. Justice had not just been served, it had fought tooth and nail to get through the front door. Around her, the room remained eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only follows an earthquake, the kind that doesn't settle, it lingers, it breathes. And then, like a spark catching fire, the first voice rose, a single clap, then another, then a wave. Applause, not for spectacle, not for drama, but for truth, for resilience, for the woman who stood against a system designed to silence her. Jasmine finally allowed herself to exhale. The battle wasn't over. Corruption didn't vanish with one arrest. But today the tide had turned. Today the courtroom remembered its purpose. Charles Lawson sat frozen in his chair, the polished steel of his cufflinks now meaningless compared to the cold dread crawling up his spine. Just moments ago, he had leaned back with smug certainty, protected by the towering figure of Judge Howard Gates, his shield, his firewall, his untouchable ally. But now that shield had shattered in front of a crowd of stunned witnesses. Gates had been hauled out of the courtroom like a common criminal, his cries for control drowned in the sound of handcuffs. Lawson's breath hitched, his once flushed face turned a sickly shade of pale, and his perfectly tailored suit could no longer disguise the tremble in his hands. The room that had once bent to his money was now bending toward truth, and for the first time in years, Charles Lawson felt something he wasn't used to: vulnerability. The mask of power had been ripped off, and all that remained was a man who knew he was next. Jasmine saw it. She had seen it before. The shift in the eyes, the cracking of the facade, the collapse of arrogance into fear. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped toward him, slow and deliberate, each step radiating purpose. Her voice was low but piercing, cutting through the silence that had settled in the courtroom like fog. "Well, Mr. Lawson," she said, stopping just short of his table, "now that your judge is in cuffs, what's your next move? Still planning to stay silent, or are you ready to start thinking about survival?" Her words were calm, but each syllable struck like a gavel. Lawson blinked, lips twitching, mouth dry. He looked around, hoping, praying for a lifeline. But no one moved. No one dared speak. The reporters were locked on him, pens poised. The jury stared with a hunger for truth. The courtroom was no longer his sanctuary. It was a cage. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, swallowing hard. The sweat on his forehead betrayed his internal war, one between loyalty to a crumbling empire and the primal instinct to save himself. Jasmine didn't press. She knew the silence was doing more damage than any accusation could. Lawson shifted in his seat, a man unraveling thread by thread. Then finally, with a voice so hoarse it barely registered, he whispered, "I'll talk." The room didn't move. Jasmine didn't blink. "But I need protection," he added, his eyes now locked onto hers, not with power, but with plea. "If I testify, I want assurances. I want immunity, security, everything." His voice cracked under the weight of desperation, and in that moment, the man who once built towers now looked like one about to collapse. Jasmine stepped closer, never breaking eye contact. "If you want protection," she said, her tone as steady as a judge's verdict, "you'll give me everything. Names, numbers, accounts, contracts. No omissions, no games." Lawson nodded frantically, the calm businessman now reduced to a frightened witness, begging for mercy. "I have documents," he stammered. "Emails, wire transfers, offshore accounts. I kept everything just in case. I didn't think I'd need it, but—" Jasmine raised a hand, stopping him. "Save it for the deposition. Right now, you need to decide if you're ready to walk into that fire. Because if you lie, even once, I'll drag you down myself." Her words didn't rise in volume, but they thundered through the room with finality. Lawson nodded again, slower this time, his breathing ragged. "I'm done lying," he muttered. "I'll give you everything." The tension in the courtroom shifted again. Not lighter, never that, but sharper. Everyone could feel it. A tide had turned. One man in cuffs, another about to turn. Jasmine turned away from him and walked calmly back to her table. But the energy in the room followed her like a current. The woman who had been mocked, insulted, silenced, now stood as the axis around which justice began to spin. Behind her, Lawson sat slumped, no longer the untouchable executive, but the first of many dominoes ready to fall. Jasmine moved with deliberate focus, arranging a fresh stack of documents on the prosecution table with the precision of someone preparing for battle. The courtroom, still reeling from the arrest of Judge Gates and the dramatic capitulation of Charles Lawson, was taut with anticipation. Each new piece of evidence she produced wasn't merely paperwork, it was ammunition, meticulously prepared to target the shadowy network that had flourished unseen for far too long. She took a deep breath, eyes briefly closing, and then opened them to reveal a sharpness honed by years of injustice, dismissals, and silent battles fought behind closed doors. As she lifted the first folder, a palpable electricity surged through the gallery, the jurors leaning forward involuntarily, hungry for more. Jasmine's voice remained firm, authoritative, yet carefully controlled, refusing to betray the intensity of the fire burning beneath her calm exterior. She stepped forward and began presenting her next line of evidence. Bank statements, phone records, and emails, each meticulously verified, each implicating additional figures hidden deep within the city's power structure. With each page she turned, another name emerged from the shadows. Prominent council members, influential bureaucrats, key players in the local political machine. These were men and women who had operated quietly, safely shielded by the power and authority of Judge Gates and the money of Lawson's vast empire. Jasmine's revelations unraveled the carefully woven fabric of their hidden operations, showing a web of collusion and secret alliances. Each piece of evidence was precise, irrefutable, surgically presented to ensure there was no escape, no room for doubt. Her words echoed through the courtroom with a clarity that felt almost brutal. "Here we have emails proving direct communication between city planners and representatives from Lawson's corporation, orchestrating zoning approvals and illegal budget allocations." Jasmine's voice grew sharper, each syllable landing like a targeted strike. "This is not speculation. This is corruption, documented, undeniable, and systemic." Around her, reporters scribbled furiously, knowing that every word Jasmine uttered would shape tomorrow's headlines. The camera shutters clicked rapidly, capturing every subtle shift of her expression, every resolute gesture. The defendants, who had believed themselves untouchable, now sat silent, faces frozen with shock or flushed with quiet rage. Jasmine didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The truth she unveiled wasn't simply incriminating, it was incendiary, igniting anger, disbelief, and a burning demand for accountability. With each revelation, Jasmine pushed the narrative further, exposing how public trust had been betrayed repeatedly, deliberately, without remorse. Her gaze briefly swept across the defendant's table, noting how each powerful figure squirmed beneath the scrutiny of justice long deferred. This was a reckoning, relentless and methodical, and Jasmine Crockett was the unflinching force behind it. As she continued, presenting phone records that aligned perfectly with suspicious transactions, the sense of betrayal in the courtroom grew heavier. Citizens seated in the gallery began exchanging stunned glances, recognizing names and faces once trusted implicitly. The reality sank in. This wasn't just one judge or one businessman. This was a network, an intricate conspiracy that had siphoned away the very integrity of the community. Jasmine paused briefly, holding up a file labeled prominently, City Hall Communications. Her voice hardened further as she opened it, laying bare more damning exchanges. In these records, she said, holding everyone's attention, you'll see direct conversations between senior city officials discussing the cover-up of environmental violations, financial fraud, and outright bribery. Each conversation reveals an indifference to legality, morality, and public welfare. Her tone carried unmistakable contempt, not personal but moral, a reflection of her disgust at the scale of injustice. Jasmine placed another document under the courtroom projector, a detailed spreadsheet with highlighted names of city council members and senior municipal officials. This is just the surface, she stated gravely. The deeper we look, the more we find. Payments hidden as campaign contributions, favors exchanged in secret meetings, the abuse of public office so routine it became invisible. She spoke slowly now, letting each word resonate, allowing the full impact of her revelations to settle heavily into the room. How deep does this rot go? How many trusted public servants have traded their integrity for profit, thinking they would never be caught? The courtroom shifted again, no longer in shock, but in a dawning collective outrage. Jasmine's steady revelations felt relentless, unstoppable, meticulously stripping away every lie until only bare, unvarnished truth remained. Hours passed like minutes, the tension never breaking. Finally, as the day neared its close, Jasmine addressed the judge's now empty seat, her voice resolute but not celebratory. Today's evidence reveals something more than individual crimes, she said. It reveals a systemic betrayal, one built and protected by those who swore oaths to serve justice, not undermine it. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, meeting the gaze of each juror in turn, her sincerity undeniable, her purpose unshakable. If a judge like Howard Gates, a man trusted to uphold the very essence of justice, can willingly conceal such profound corruption, she continued, then we must ask ourselves, who else is lurking behind that curtain, pulling strings, betraying our trust? Her question hung in the air, piercingly sharp, impossible to ignore. Outside the courthouse moments later, beneath glaring camera lights and amidst shouting reporters, Jasmine stood composed but unsmiling. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders burdened by the weight of truths she had carried alone until now. Microphones reached toward her like branches seeking light, desperate for her next statement. She breathed deeply, then spoke slowly, clearly, knowing each word carried immense weight. Today isn't a victory, she began, silencing the crowd instantly. Today is simply exposure. The exposure of rot so deep, so pervasive, that one arrest, one verdict cannot erase it. Her gaze hardened further as she continued. Justice doesn't come from merely removing one corrupt individual. It comes when an entire system is held accountable, when every hidden accomplice faces the consequences of their betrayal. The crowd murmured, cameras flashed again, capturing the intensity of her expression, the gravity in her voice. Jasmine took a moment, then finished with unmistakable resolve. I won't rest until this system is truly cleansed, until public service means transparency, accountability, and justice for everyone, not just the privileged few. As she stepped away, reporters clamored with questions, but Jasmine didn't pause again. She walked with unwavering determination, knowing this was only the beginning of a far longer fight. There was no celebration tonight, no sense of triumph. Only the heavy realization of how deeply rooted the injustice had grown and how much remained undone. As Jasmine climbed into her waiting car, she allowed herself one brief moment of reflection. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, thinking back to every insult, every dismissal, every injustice she'd faced. The courtroom had tried to break her, tried to silence her voice and bury her beneath layers of power and privilege. But Jasmine had survived, unbroken, undeterred. And now the very institutions that had sought to silence her would have to face her again tomorrow, and every day after, until genuine justice prevailed. She opened her eyes, determined and focused, knowing exactly what lay ahead. The battle was far from over, but now she wasn't alone. As her car pulled away, the courthouse faded into the rearview mirror. Jasmine didn't look back. Ahead of her lay the promise not of victory, but of justice truly restored. Painstaking, relentless, hard-earned. This wasn't the end. It was the first chapter in a much larger, more difficult story. But Jasmine was ready for the fight, and justice, delayed but not denied, finally had a voice powerful enough to confront the darkness that had hidden for far too long. In the weeks following Judge Gates's dramatic arrest, Jasmine Crockett's story ignited a wildfire across the legal world. Headlines exploded from every newspaper, every blog, every television network, declaring a seismic shift within the corridors of justice. Jasmine's fearless stand in the courtroom, her quiet defiance in the face of entrenched corruption, was dissected, analyzed, and discussed at every level of academia. Professors at prestigious law schools began referencing her courtroom battle as a defining moment in modern jurisprudence. Her unwavering courage became a case study overnight. Her tactics and strategy meticulously analyzed by students eager to emulate her determination and integrity. Lecture halls that once echoed with dry recitations of old cases now vibrated with spirited discussions about Jasmine's bravery in confronting an unjust system. Her story had transcended the simple facts of a trial. It had become an anthem of resilience, a rallying cry for aspiring legal professionals who had begun to doubt the purity of their chosen path. Suddenly, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a lawyer who had won a high-profile corruption case. She was a symbol of hope, a living example that justice was attainable, even when it felt utterly impossible. Soon, law schools nationwide began inviting Jasmine to speak, eager to capture a fraction of her powerful authenticity in front of their students. She was initially hesitant, remembering the isolation she felt standing alone against Gates's relentless insults and mocking laughter. But soon she realized the importance of sharing her experience, of speaking openly about the bitter sting of injustice that had nearly broken her, yet ultimately sharpened her resolve. On her first appearance at Harvard Law, the lecture hall overflowed, students squeezing into aisles and stairways just to catch a glimpse of the woman whose courage had shattered a corrupted judge's empire. Jasmine stood at the podium, her calm, clear voice resonating with quiet authority as she recounted every devastating moment. The biting insults, the relentless interruptions, the soul-crushing contempt. Her words painted vivid scenes, taking listeners directly into the tension-filled courtroom, allowing them to feel each painful silence, each heart-pounding instant of defiance. She described how Gates had mocked her credentials, dismissed her evidence, and belittled her integrity, hoping to crush her spirit. Yet Jasmine's voice never trembled. Her eyes never wavered as she recounted those moments, transforming each bitter memory into powerful fuel for justice. As Jasmine spoke, an intense silence enveloped the hall. Every eye locked on her as she detailed the precise moment she revealed Gates's voice on the recording, ordering evidence destroyed, sealing his fate. She described vividly how the judge's arrogance collapsed into helpless fury, the gleam of the cuffs reflecting in his eyes, the stunned disbelief of the powerful who had considered themselves untouchable. Her listeners leaned forward, breaths shallow, pulses quickening, as if reliving that electrifying courtroom battle themselves. Jasmine's storytelling brought them face to face with the reality of corruption, vividly illustrating how power could be misused, justice manipulated, and how one determined individual could disrupt even the strongest grip of institutional wrongdoing. Her story wasn't merely about legal victory. It was about the lonely, daunting path of choosing truth over comfort, integrity over compliance. Each word resonated deeply, igniting a fire within every listener, reaffirming the core reason many had chosen the study of law: to confront injustice, no matter the odds. After that first electrifying lecture, Jasmine's inbox was inundated with letters and messages from law students across the nation. Students who saw in her not just a legal success story, but a personal hero. Letters poured in from young women who had faced their own forms of discrimination, subtle or overt, detailing how Jasmine's courage had reignited their belief in themselves. Many of the letters expressed feelings of isolation similar to what Jasmine herself had faced, thanking her for openly acknowledging that the battle against injustice often began as a solitary fight. Some letters, handwritten and deeply personal, came from students who had nearly abandoned their dream of practicing law, disillusioned by the seemingly overwhelming presence of corruption and inequality. Jasmine's struggle, her refusal to be silenced, had become their beacon, pulling them back from the edge of surrender. They wrote passionately, describing how her perseverance had shown them that true strength wasn't found in titles or accolades. It came from standing firm when everyone else urged retreat. As months passed, Jasmine's story became permanently embedded into the curriculum of law schools nationwide. Casebooks added detailed accounts of her courtroom showdown, framing her meticulous preparation and unyielding ethics as a new standard of legal practice. Professors referenced her case not just for its legal precedents, but as a profound example of ethical responsibility, highlighting how Jasmine had exposed systemic rot while enduring public humiliation and intense personal risk. Students no longer discussed Jasmine Crockett merely as a lawyer. They debated her as an embodiment of moral courage and uncompromising integrity. Classroom discussions often evolved into passionate debates on how to maintain ethical clarity in the face of overwhelming pressure, an acknowledgement of the difficult yet essential path Jasmine had walked. Her legacy resonated not through flashy victories, but in the quiet, unwavering strength she had displayed, reminding future lawyers of the true nature of justice, a fight that required unending commitment, not quick celebrations. Recognizing the profound influence of her journey, several leading universities eventually established annual awards in Jasmine's name, honoring students who demonstrated extraordinary courage and moral integrity in legal pursuits. Jasmine herself often found these gestures overwhelming, deeply moved by the idea that her personal struggle could spark such lasting inspiration. Yet she always reminded her audiences that her path had never been heroic or glamorous. It had been painful, isolating, exhausting. The lessons she offered were starkly honest. Fighting injustice was rarely comfortable or applauded. More often, it was lonely and intensely challenging. Jasmine warned her listeners not to romanticize her experience, but to prepare themselves for similar trials. Her truth resonated powerfully. Justice wasn't an easy road, nor was it guaranteed. It required fierce dedication, immense courage, and a relentless willingness to endure ridicule, dismissal, and doubt without ever sacrificing personal integrity. One evening, after another packed lecture, Jasmine sat quietly in her office, surrounded by dozens of heartfelt letters from young legal minds inspired by her journey. She carefully opened one envelope, reading words from a first-year law student who described struggling to find purpose in a profession seemingly tainted by privilege and corruption. The letter concluded with simple gratitude. "Your fight showed me what the law truly can be. Not just a tool for the powerful, but a voice for those who have none. You taught me not to seek applause, but to seek truth. Thank you for showing me the courage I need to fight." Jasmine's eyes softened with emotion, a quiet strength settling deep within her. In that moment, she felt a powerful confirmation that every insult endured, every dismissive glance, every brutal injustice had been worth it. Not for the fame or recognition, but for the ripple of inspiration her solitary stand had created. Slowly placing the letter aside, Jasmine stood, looking through her office window at the city lights flickering below. The path ahead was still uncertain, the fight for justice still fraught with difficulty and hardship. Yet now Jasmine Crockett no longer felt isolated. She knew an entire generation of passionate young lawyers stood ready behind her, inspired by her relentless pursuit of truth. They had seen her face ridicule and emerge stronger, watched her confront injustice alone, armed only with facts and unyielding ethics. Jasmine realized profoundly that she had become not just a symbol of strength, but a catalyst, a spark igniting countless young hearts ready to confront their own battles, ready to uphold justice no matter the cost. With renewed determination, she smiled quietly to herself, knowing her story was now part of a larger narrative, empowering a generation unafraid to challenge corruption. And as Jasmine stepped out into the night, the city seemed brighter, not because injustice had vanished, but because through her courage, a new wave of fearless advocates had found their voice. Jasmine paused, allowing herself a brief, quiet moment of reflection. Outside her window, twilight had fallen, casting long shadows over the city skyline. Shadows that reminded her of battles fought, sacrifices made, and how fragile yet persistent justice truly was. Her desk, illuminated softly by the lamp's glow, was scattered with the letters from students, each one carrying voices full of hope, determination, and gratitude. As her fingers gently brushed the handwritten notes, Jasmine felt something shift profoundly inside her, deeper than pride, stronger than relief, a sense of true purpose, raw and uncompromising. She realized, in that quiet solitude, that every bitter humiliation, every harsh insult, every painful dismissal she endured in Gates's courtroom had not weakened her resolve. Instead, they had forged it into an unbreakable weapon. It wasn't her courtroom victory or the downfall of one powerful man that mattered most. It was this legacy she was now creating, the endless echoes of inspiration born from her courage to stand alone. Rising slowly from her chair, Jasmine approached the window, gazing at the glowing lights that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Her reflection in the glass, once marked by quiet uncertainty, now held a calm, assured strength. She recognized herself clearly for the first time, not as a hero, but as someone who simply refused to accept injustice as normal. The trials she faced were never about personal triumph. They were about proving that true justice was possible, even in the darkest corners of a system corrupted by power and privilege. She saw now that her most significant achievement wasn't simply exposing corruption, it was illuminating the hidden strength within others, inspiring countless souls to find their own voices, to wage their own battles against inequality. Jasmine understood deeply that this fight, her fight, had never been solitary. It had always belonged to everyone who yearned for fairness, everyone who felt silenced by power, everyone who needed reassurance that standing alone, though difficult, could indeed change everything. Stepping away from the window, Jasmine carefully collected the letters into a neat pile, treating each one as a precious artifact of hope. Her thoughts traveled back again to that first day in Gates' courtroom, recalling vividly the weight of his insults, how deeply his dismissals cut, how desperately he had tried to break her spirit. She remembered the moments when doubt crept silently into her heart, whispering that perhaps she wasn't strong enough, wasn't worthy enough to face such monumental opposition. Yet those painful memories no longer felt heavy. Instead, they fueled her resolve, a permanent reminder of what she had overcome. Every mocking word, every act of contempt had become part of the fabric of her strength. Jasmine smiled softly, knowing the cruelty she'd faced had not diminished her. It had sharpened her, transforming hardship into wisdom, insult into insight, isolation into unyielding determination. Those wounds were now badges she wore proudly, reminders not of her victimhood, but of her fierce resilience. Slowly, methodically, Jasmine took one final look around her quiet office. Each corner spoke silently of her journey. The meticulously prepared evidence folders stacked high, the framed photographs of grateful clients whose battles had seemed impossible, the worn volumes of law that had guided her through every dark moment. These were symbols of a life devoted to challenging injustice, evidence of a commitment that had grown stronger each time the world tried to silence her. She realized now deeply and clearly that justice was not an endpoint to be reached and then forgotten. It was an ongoing, relentless process, forever evolving, forever demanding vigilance, courage, and sacrifice. Jasmine understood profoundly that her fight was never about her alone. It was always about something far greater. The collective strength of those who refused to remain silent, who dared to face down power, even if it meant standing alone. Her story, she knew, had become a bridge, connecting isolated individuals into a formidable movement, one voice becoming many, each inspired by a single act of courage. Quietly, she turned off the lamp, letting the comforting darkness fill the room. But the darkness no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful, reflective. It was in this quiet moment that Jasmine fully grasped the depth of her impact. She had not merely achieved justice in one case. She had ignited a movement, inspiring generations to believe in their own power. The truth echoed clearly now. Justice was never granted from above, never given freely by the powerful. Instead, it rose from below, fought for by ordinary people who refused to surrender their voices. Jasmine had become not the hero who rescued them, but rather the spark that reminded them of their own courage, their own worthiness, their own unstoppable strength. This was her true victory, not a legal triumph, but a human awakening, a profound recognition that justice was everyone's responsibility, shared by all who dared to speak out against injustice, even if their voices shook. Stepping into the quiet corridor beyond her office, Jasmine walked slowly toward the elevator, her footsteps echoing softly in the emptiness. As she pressed the button, a voice broke the silence behind her. She turned, startled, to see a young woman standing nervously near the office door, her eyes wide with admiration and a hint of hesitation. The young woman, clearly a law student, clutching a notebook tightly, stepped forward tentatively, her voice soft yet firm. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she began shyly, "but I heard your speech today, your story, your courage. It reminded me why I chose to study law in the first place." Jasmine felt warmth bloom deeply within her chest, the genuine words reaching past her defenses and touching something profoundly real. The young woman continued, voice trembling slightly but growing stronger. "You showed me that even one person can make a difference, that standing alone, even when everyone doubts you, is sometimes the most powerful act of all." Jasmine listened quietly, deeply moved, realizing once again how powerfully interconnected her journey had become with those who came after her. With gentle determination, Jasmine stepped closer to the student, her voice reassuring and sincere. "Remember," she said softly, meeting the student's eyes, "justice isn't something given to us. It's something we create every single day by refusing to remain silent, by daring to speak truth when everyone else chooses comfort. Never underestimate the power you hold simply by deciding you will not look away." The young woman nodded slowly, visibly inspired, her courage visibly strengthened by Jasmine's words. "I won't forget that," she whispered firmly. Jasmine placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, smiling softly. "Good," she said simply, the quiet encouragement in her voice infinitely powerful. "Because the fight for justice isn't easy, but it's always worth it." As Jasmine stepped into the elevator and watched the doors begin to close, the student called out one final, heartfelt question. "But aren't you tired? After all you faced, after standing alone for so long?" Jasmine paused thoughtfully, reflecting deeply before responding, her voice resonant with quiet strength. "Of course I've been tired," she admitted truthfully. "Exhausted sometimes, even discouraged. But I've never been alone, not truly. Every voice that now speaks up, every heart brave enough to challenge injustice, stands beside me. And that, more than anything else, keeps me going. Justice isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, a relay passed on through generations. Each of us carries it forward. Each of us matters." Jasmine smiled gently, knowing these words would remain forever etched in the young student's memory, serving as a guiding star in the difficult moments ahead. Walking out into the cool night air, Jasmine breathed deeply, feeling a renewed sense of purpose flooding her being. The city lights shimmered softly, distant yet vibrant, a perfect reflection of her journey, illuminated by countless struggles, each one transforming darkness into hope. Jasmine Crockett had stood alone, had endured humiliation, injustice, and profound doubt. But in doing so, she had ignited a fire capable of illuminating countless hearts, forever reminding them that true justice, no matter how long delayed, would always be worth fighting for. And as she stepped into the future, Jasmine knew this truth profoundly. Justice didn't need a powerful throne to flourish. It only required someone brave enough to stand up, even when standing alone was the hardest thing imaginable. Her fight wasn't finished. It never would be. But Jasmine felt peace knowing she would never stand alone again. Because through her courage, countless others had learned to rise. If you've ever felt small in the face of power, if you've ever been mocked, ignored, or silenced for daring to speak the truth, this story was made for you. Jasmine's journey is more than just the triumph of justice. It's proof that even a single voice brave enough to speak up can shake an entire system built on injustice. Jasmine stood firm against ridicule, against contempt, and against an overwhelming force determined to crush her. And in doing so, she became a beacon of strength and hope for millions. Remember, you're not alone. Let this story become your strength, your courage, your motivation to raise your voice even louder. Every small voice matters, and when we join together, our collective courage becomes unstoppable. Take action right now, like subscribe and share this story widely, not just to spread inspiration, but to empower those who are still fighting quietly, desperately seeking the courage to stand. Because sometimes it takes only one brave voice to challenge an entire corrupt system, and the next voice to change the world could very well be yours.